All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. This is an educational channel. We take a look at great theories of everything, ancient and modern, and try to parse them out and figure out how to use these things in our own lives. Today is our 579th video on the reciprocal system of theory from Dewey B. Larson. If you'd like any more information on Mr. Larson's theory, watch any of my first 474 videos on the subject. We are reading from his book called The Road to Permanent Prosperity today, one of his two books on economics. And we are in chapter 24, which is called Stabilization Methods. And I think I lost my place here with this book, but Mr. Larson was one of the few scientists to propose a universe made out of motion. Not matter, not energy, but motion. And for Larson, motion was the relationship between space and time. That is a reciprocal relationship, hence the reciprocal system of theory for the name of his theory. In 1959, Mr. Larson proposed his two fundamental postulates about how the universe operated. The first and most important postulate is that the universe is composed entirely of one component, motion, existing in 3 dimensions in discrete units and with 2 reciprocal aspects, space and time. And then the second postulate is just that the universe is conforms to the relations of ordinary commutative mathematics. Its primary magnitudes are absolute and its geometry is Euclidean. Larson plugs the first postulate into the second and arrives at a theoretical universe about how he believes the universe is constructed. And then he compares his theoretical universe with the measured empirical universe of modern science. Larson was able to practically recreate many of the scientific tables, including the periodic table, from theory, and does that in many of his books, especially in his book on chemistry called Basic Properties of Matter, where he derives equations for many of the basic properties of matter, such as the melting point and the specific heat and the compressibility. And he also does similar things in his book on astronomy, Universe of Motion. He's got a couple books on physics, and 2 books on economics, 1 book on metaphysics, including philosophy, religion, and psychology. I've gone through many of those books on this channel already, read them from cover to cover, and so you can go into the library and check those out. Usually I preface them with a fairly detailed description of Larson's postulates and their ramifications and consequences and so on. So you want to check those out if you want to get into Larson's work more. If you want to start fresh in this book, The Road to Permanent Prosperity, go back about 7 weeks in the archives and start with chapter 1. But right now we are in the middle of chapter 24 out of 26. So we're almost done with this book. This is on Stabilization Methods 1, and this is where Larson really arrives at the crux of his solutions to arrive at a road to permanent prosperity by judiciously, unobtrusively kind of regulating the reservoirs or the storage of money that kind of affects the boom and bust cycle of our economic system, an economic system in motion, and with the reciprocal aspects of production and consumption. So we'll let Larson speak here, and get into the second half of chapter 24, Stabilization Methods 1. While this plan, and he's referring to a, let's see what this plan is. You may need to go back to the last video. I think he'll probably explain what he's talking about here. So let's just keep going into it. While this plan gained some attention during the Depression of the 1930s, when the authorities were desperate for some kind of an answer to the problem, it was quickly dropped when the Depression experience was subjected to more critical examination after the emergency was over. This was, of course, a reflection of the fact that the shortcomings of the plan had already become apparent to those who studied the situation carefully. It has, however, become necessary, or been necessary, to give the subject some consideration here in order to complete the theoretical picture of the possible methods of control, and also to lay the groundwork for the discussion of a different kind of manipulation of the goods reservoirs that we will take up in the next chapter. The post-Depression review did include consideration of the following suggestion. Quote, increase production to match the excessive supply of money. The thought here is that since money inflation is due to the availability of too much money purchasing power relative to the volume of goods currently produced, the remedy is to increase the volume of goods to an equality with the amount of money purchasing power. If the volume of goods could be increased independently of the purchasing power, this idea might have some merit, but as has been emphasized repeatedly in the preceding pages, it is impossible to produce goods without at the same time, and by the same act, producing an equal amount of purchasing power. An unbalanced excess of money purchasing power, therefore, cannot be corrected by increasing production. Another variation of the production control idea is based on the overproduction theory of the business cycle, which was widely accepted during the Depression era of the 1930s. This theory contends that we are producing too much during the boom periods, and that the depression or recession comes about because of the necessity for cutting down production to enable using up the accumulated surpluses. The proposed control system therefore contemplates reducing the volume of production during the inflationary phase of the cycle and assumes that this reduction will automatically result in an increased amount of production during the low stages of the cycle. The falsity of the assumptions on which the overproduction theory is based is now generally recognized, and for present purposes, it should be sufficient to say that the business cycle is a result of totally different causes. Whatever variation in production takes place during the successive phases of the cycle is an effect of the cyclical variation, not the cause thereof. Thus, all of the proposals that envision economic stabilization by storage of goods or regulation of the volume of production are inherently unsatisfactory. Even those proposals that are theoretically feasible are unworkable in practice due to the physical limitations on the possibility of goods storage. Furthermore, the method by which the control is supposed to be exercised is objectionable per se. Maintenance of a steady flow of goods to the consumers is one of the prime objectives of economic policy, and any measure which aims to achieve business stability by introducing arbitrary irregularities into the flow of goods is prescribing a cure which may be as bad as the disease. The economic unbalance that causes the cyclical swings can be corrected only by attacking it where it originates, in the money purchasing power stream flowing to the markets. Some of the measures discussed in the preceding chapter were aimed in this correct direction, but these measures fail to qualify as effective control devices primarily because they operate indirectly and hence do not have the positive and certain effect that is necessary for accurate control. Restriction of credit, for example, tends to discourage withdrawals from the money reservoirs, but there is no direct relationship. We cannot say that an increase of X% in the rediscount rate will reduce the use of credit by Y%. What we need is a mechanism that does have this kind of a direct connection. If our reports indicate that the reservoir withdrawals are currently exceeding inputs by $1 million per day, then for positive control of the situation, we need a direct mechanism whereby we can divert $1 million per day from the swollen money purchasing power stream until the excess withdrawals from the consumer reservoirs cease. The most obvious means of accomplishing this objective is to utilize government fiscal policy. The government is continually receiving a large inflow of money from taxation and other sources, and there is a corresponding outflow of similar proportions. On the average, these two streams are equal, unless the government has deliberately embarked on an inflationary course. But there is no requirement that a continuing equilibrium be maintained. And at any particular time, there is usually a net excess, either of receipts or of expenditures. Such an excess constitutes an input into or a withdrawal from a purchasing power reservoir. And these reservoir transactions have exactly the same effect on economic equilibrium as transactions of equal magnitude in the private sector. Since the government transactions are subject to deliberate control, if control seems advisable, we have here the kind of a direct and positive mechanism that we need for the purpose of offsetting the fluctuations in the flow into and out of purchasing power reservoirs. A general recognition of the potential of government financial dealings as a means of control of the level of business activity has been achieved in the last few decades, and compensatory fiscal policy currently receives widespread support, at least in principle. Unfortunately, however, present-day economic thought fails to distinguish between the problem of economic stability and the employment problem. As a result, fiscal policy is not primarily utilized or advocated for the purpose of maintaining a stable level of prices and business activity, an objective to which it is well adapted, but for the purpose of minimizing unemployment, an objective toward which it can make no more than a temporary and uncertain contribution, and this only at a rather high cost in the form of inflation. This subject was given a great deal of attention in the era following the 1930 Depression. Arthur Smithies gave this report as of 1948. Quote, "The idea of a government commitment to maintain full employment through fiscal policy became widely accepted. The Employment Act of 1946 in this country originated as a proposal to achieve full employment through fiscal policy alone, end quote. But a commitment to do something means nothing at all unless that something can be done. And the fact that unemployment is still our most critical domestic problem emphasizes this point. Disappointing results are inevitable as long as fiscal policy is directed toward the wrong objective. Many of the economists who analyzed the position of economic theory in the post-depression review mentioned earlier were uneasy about the relation between employment and inflation. It is possible, reported Thorpe and Quant in 1959, that monetary policy may create a conflict between two ultimate objectives of society, namely between full employment and price stability. And Smithies admitted that, quote, we have as yet no answer to our main question of fiscal policy. Is it possible to prevent inflation and achieve maximum production at the same time? End quote. Over the next few years, Keynes and his disciples gave an authoritative negative answer to this question, as indicated in the following statement. Quote, with remarkable prescience, both Keynes and Mrs. Robinson foresaw in the pre-war period the dilemma facing most Western nations today, the impossibility of achieving simultaneously and without price or wage controls the twin goals of full employment and price stability. In the absence of any contradictory experience or new theoretical understanding, the existence of this dilemma is accepted by modern economists of all schools of thought, as noted in the discussion in Chapter 2. Notwithstanding the near unanimity of this opinion, it is definitely wrong. Coexistence of full employment and zero inflation is not impossible. What is impossible is to attain both goals by means of the same measure, as the monetary authorities, following the advice of the economists, have been trying to do. There is no common solution for both problems, but, as has been explained in the preceding pages, both goals can be reached if they are approached separately, each by the methods appropriate for that problem. I'll stop right here just to mention that Larson has two books on economics. This one is called The Road to Permanent Prosperity. The other one is called The Road to Full Employment. So Larson separates the two, and he comes up with answers for both of them separately. So, it may behoove us here in the future to also go through that other book, so that we have both prongs of the approach that's needed to allay all of our economic woes. What is necessary to recognize is that monetary and fiscal measures are stabilization tools, not employment tools, and they should be used when and as needed for stabilization purposes only, leaving the employment situation for treatment by measures specifically adapted to employment. In undertaking an analysis of the practical methods that are available for applying fiscal policy to the stabilization program, it should be emphasized at the outset that the objective to be accomplished by a stabilization program, as we have identified it in the foregoing pages, is to counterbalance the net excess of money purchasing power reservoir transactions, whatever direction and magnitude that net excess may take. Thus, the effectiveness of any specific measure is determined by the extent to which it contributes toward this objective, and any merit that it may have from some other standpoint is irrelevant. A measure that increases production, for example, may be quite helpful in relieving distress during a depression, but production adds equally to the stream of goods and the stream of purchasing power, and therefore accomplishes nothing toward correcting the purchasing power unbalance that causes the depression. Such a measure has no value for stabilization purposes, however useful it may be in other respects. The same is true, in large part, of most of the so-called built-in stabilizers, which are so widely hailed as bulwarks of the present-day economy. Unemployment insurance, says Arthur F. Burns, is the nation's first line of defense against depressions. When business activity falls off, the payment of insurance benefits promptly rises, and this offsets in part the decline of income from productive employment. Galbraith views the situation in these terms, quote, "Unemployment insurance means that a man's purchasing power is protected when he loses his job. It falls, but no longer to zero. Thus, a measure designed to reduce the insecurity associated with unemployment also acts to counteract the loss of output, the economic inefficiency associated with depression." End quote. Now, let us analyze these transactions from the purchasing power standpoint and see whether these confident expectations are justified, whether unemployment insurance actually makes any contribution toward correcting the purchasing power unbalance that is the root of the trouble. This is not an inquiry as to whether or not such insurance is justified. As Galbraith pointed out, this measure is, quote, "designed to reduce the insecurity associated with unemployment." And the justifications for putting it into effect rest upon these grounds. But both Burns and Galbraith claim that it is also an anti-depression measure, and it is this claim that we want to examine. As matters now stand, if a recession gets underway, the volume of unemployment increases. Payment of unemployment benefits then rises. If the funds for making such payments are obtained by withdrawal of money from storage, the rising payments would swell the money purchasing power stream and would actually have the kind of a compensating effect that is necessary to offset the deflationary consumed reservoir transactions. But the unemployment funds are not normally held in cash by the state agencies that handle the payments. They are either invested in securities or are deposited in the banks. In order to convert the securities into cash, they must be sold. The amounts paid by the purchasers of these securities then decrease the money purchasing power available for buying goods in general by exactly the same amount that the purchasing power is increased by the unemployment benefits. The net effect on the economic unbalance is therefore zero. Where the money is withdrawn from the banks rather than from investments, the final result is the same if the banks find it necessary to reduce their loans or investments in order to meet the demand for cash. No contribution towards stabilization is made unless 1. The banks happen to have excess reserves from which the funds can be obtained, or 2. The need for cash is met by new currency issued through the Federal Reserve rediscount procedure. The act of built-in stabilizers is therefore very uncertain and there is no assurance that the stabilizing effect will materialize at all. A better case can be made out for those programs such as the income tax, which rises and falls in conformity with the general state of affairs. With the general state of business. Here again, however, the ultimate effect is dependent entirely on the means which are employed to meet the varying demands on the Treasury. If the loss in revenue due to a decrease in income tax collections is offset by inflationary means, by currency issues, or by drawing upon bank reserves, and the same mechanisms are employed in reverse to dispose of excess collections during boom times, the stabilizing effect is actually realized. But if the losses in revenue in the downswing are offset by the sale of bonds to the general public, or by bank borrowing that results in the sale of securities or curtailment of loans by the banks, or by a reduction in government expenditures, the built-in stabilizers do not stabilize. During an upswing, there is little possibility that these so-called stabilizers will accomplish anything at all, as higher tax receipts normally stimulate government expenditures, and even if the excess tax collections are not spent, they will have the required deflationary effect only if they add to bank reserves or are utilized to retire currency, neither of which is at all likely during a period of expanding business activity. The same considerations apply with even greater force to similar stabilizing efforts by private business. Economists usually look with favor on these efforts. Most of them would probably agree with this statement, quote, "The practice of accumulating reserves by private enterprises in prosperous times and dispersing them as dividends when current profits are low is all in the right direction," end quote. But such reserves contribute to stability only if they are maintained in the form of cash, and business concerns cannot afford to accept the penalty of loss of earning power that would result from carrying unnecessary cash balances, nor would they want to retain custody of such large amounts of cash if they did accumulate them. Any excess cash is deposited in the banks, and in a period of rising business activity, the banks promptly turn around and lend the money to someone else. The mere fact that the business enterprises enter these amounts as reserves on their books means nothing from the standpoint of the economy in general. The money that they do not disperse is spent by others, and the end result is the same as if these firms had paid the dividends currently and thus permitted the stockholders to spend the money. If the reserves are invested instead of being deposited in the banks, the purchasing power is simply transferred to the sellers of the securities. When these securities are sold during a recession to obtain funds with which to pay dividends, this process is reversed. The buyers of the securities transfer purchasing power to the business, which then turns it over to the stockholders. All of these transactions are exchanges at the same economic location. Hence, in each case, the total amount of purchasing power available for the buying of goods remains exactly the same as it was to begin with. And that's principle 15. The factors which make the stabilization efforts of the individual firms fruitless are inescapable from a practical standpoint, as the cost of maintaining large idle cash balances is prohibitive. However, the government is not limited in this manner, and it would be entirely feasible to handle government fiscal operations in a counter-cyclical manner, so that the inputs into or withdrawals from the government money reservoirs counterbalance the net total of the transactions affecting the other consumer money reservoirs. Keynes's deficit spending policy, which has been the cornerstone of U.S. government's countercyclical efforts since the Depression days of the 1930s, is aimed in this direction. Just how to appraise the results of this policy has been a matter of much controversy. On the one hand, it is clear that the problem has not been solved. The admitted fact that the threat of recession, and perhaps depression as well, still hangs over us is positive proof of this. But it is also clear that the policy that has been followed has, on several occasions, injected a certain amount of life, or at least semblance of life, into the economic picture. As matters now stand, therefore, a continuation and extension of deficit spending is strongly advocated by one faction and bitterly opposed by another. Some of Keynes's disciples have even gone so far as to contend that it is no longer possible for a private enterprise economy to operate on a self-sustaining basis, and that a permanent deficit spending policy is essential to prevent utter collapse of the economic structure. For some reason, probably connected with their orientation toward sociological objectives, spending seems to have a peculiar fascination for the economists. As Viner put it, quote, "It must not be forgotten that spending in itself is, for the spenders, the supreme pleasure," end quote. It is common practice among Keynesians to extol the merits of government spending and to minimize its disadvantages. Deficit spending, Burns and Watson explain, is part and parcel of the growth of government initiative and enterprise as a dynamic element in the economic system. And Larson puts in parentheses, whatever that means, so you can understand where he's coming from. Now, we have a couple more pages to get through to finish this chapter, so we will tackle that tomorrow and then move on to the next chapter, which is called Stabilization Methods, number 2. So thanks for tuning in today, and have a wonderful day.